On a silent Christmas Eve, when the world seems wrapped in warmth and candlelight, have you ever wondered what hides behind the stillness of the night? What if a dream could foretell a tragedy? What if a shadow standing at the foot of your bed wasn't a trick of the moonlight, but a visitor from somewhere you cannot name? And what if the person you loved most returned to you only after death? In Tales for Christmas Eve, by Rhoda Broughton, gentle winter moments unravel into a tapestry of haunting visions, unexplained encounters, vanished brides, ghostly warnings, and perilous midnight journeys. These stories blend romance, fear, and the supernatural into a world where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Tonight, we step into that world, a world where every whisper matters, every shadow has a story, and every heartbeat echoes between the living and something beyond. There is a certain kind of quiet that only belongs to the 19th century, an era of dim lamps, wide skies, and long roads where the world seemed larger, darker, and far less certain. It is within this hush of old Europe that our tale begins, stretching across countries and seasons, through winding railways, echoing hotel halls, and moonlit lakes. Though these stories are told as though they happened on Christmas Eve, they do not belong solely to winter. They belong to the realm where the familiar meets the uncanny, where gentle moments unravel into mysteries that linger long after the candles burn low. Imagine yourself stepping into that world now, a world of polished wooden floors, brass locks that turn with a heavy click, and thick velvet curtains that never seem to move even when a draft glides across the room. Outside, horses' hooves clatter on cobblestones, and distant bells toll the hour with somber precision. In such a world, you might believe that everything is orderly and well-behaved until night comes. For the night in these tales is no simple absence of light. It is a presence of its own, a watchful shadow creeping into the corners of every heart. Our first thread begins with a young couple whose love is fresh, trembling, and full of laughter. They have just been married 3 days only, and every step they take together tastes of novelty. Elizabeth, small and bright, with hair that softens even the strictest daylight, and her husband, whose good sense and mild cynicism balance her excitable spirit. They are traveling to begin their married life, searching with innocent enthusiasm for a place that feels like theirs, flipping through maps and debating destinations as though choosing a backdrop for the rest of their lives. Though they begin with ordinary worries, country houses that no one offers to lend, seaside breezes that might make one bilious, and hotels where patrons stare too knowingly at newlyweds, there is an undercurrent beneath Elizabeth's laughter, a tremor, a shadow, and it emerges when they speak of the lakes. The mere suggestion of returning to the region around Ulleswater chills her despite the summer heat. Bees hum lazily outside. Warm air lies thick across the garden, yet Elizabeth shivers. Something happened there once, something she prefers not to recall, but it spills out in halting confession. A mesmerist, a demonstration she agreed to, believing it harmless entertainment. She was told she would be a perfect subject, and she was terrifyingly so. She acted, danced, sang, obeyed every command with unnatural compliance. When she awoke, she fell ill for weeks, raving in a fevered delirium, trapped beneath the suffocating canopy of a red and green fern-leaf chintz bedspread. Even now, the memory clings to her like a cold hand. Her husband, half amused and half concerned, insists they avoid the lakes entirely. But the incident leaves a faint crack in the air around them, as though something unseen is already watching from afar. And so they go abroad, drifting along rivers, wandering through unfamiliar cities where people speak in languages that brush their ears like wind. In Brussels, they gaze upon the macabre paintings of Weert's dark canvases, filled with the half-dead and the nearly buried, horrors so vivid they seem to crawl off the surface. Elizabeth laughs nervously and remarks on how easily one could be trapped beneath a coffin lid. Her husband brushes aside her unease, but the shadow beside her grows sharper. One night, long past midnight, he wakes to Elizabeth, gripping his arm with desperate strength. Her face is drained of life, Her breath trembles. She insists someone was in the room. A tall man, silent as stone, with a sharply carved nose and eyes glowing like smoldering coals. He stood between the bed and the window, unmoving, commanding her without words to rise and follow. Her husband swears he saw nothing, but Elizabeth is certain. She describes the man with such clarity that the room itself seems to dim at the memory. She trembles until he lights a candle and checks every corner. The door is locked, the balcony untouched, yet the terror does not leave her. She feels as though the man's presence lingers, waiting for another moment of weakness. This is where the new thread of mystery tightens, because the man she describes will appear again and again, always just far enough away to be doubted, yet close enough to be recognized instantly. A man with no name, no voice, only a stare that reaches across rooms and through dreams, whispering a summons only she can hear. From Brussels to the Rhine, from sunny riverbanks to crowded steamers, Elizabeth tries to forget him, but something in her has shifted. Her husband notices the way she glances at windows now, as though expecting a face to appear, the way she hesitates before sleep, fearing a dream will pull her toward that commanding gaze once more. The Victorian world around them is rich with beauty, vine-covered slopes, castle ruins perched on craggy cliffs, villages with pointed roofs and ringing bells. Yet Elizabeth sees none of it fully, for every reflection in every pane of glass feels like an invitation to terror. The slight sway of a curtain, the shadow of a passer-by, the roll of mist over a hill, all seem to echo that silent figure. Her husband assures her it is all coincidence, imagination, the remnants of past trauma. But even he cannot warm the air that chills their rooms at night, or explain why the man she dreamed of bears the exact features of a mysterious stranger they glimpse upon arriving late at a hotel, a man who vanishes before they can speak to him. For though the world of the living surrounds them, it is the world of the unseen that is drawing near. The stories of Tales for Christmas Eve do not shout their horrors. They whisper them softly into the quiet of candle-lit nights. They do not rely on monsters, but on the thin veil between fear and certainty, on how easily a moment of vulnerability can widen that veil into something far more dangerous. And as the couple continues their journey, the gentle innocence of their early days begins to erode, replaced by dread, by questions, and by the growing suspicion that Elizabeth's first vision was not a dream at all, but an invitation she has already begun to answer. As their journey continued, there grew between the young husband and wife a quiet tension, soft but persistent, like the faint hum before a storm. Elizabeth tried to hide it with her usual brightness, but even the most innocent remarks now carried a fragile undertone. She had always possessed a lively mind, full of sudden fancies and playful leaps of imagination, yet her husband began to notice how those fancies had darkened. She had grown unusually sensitive to small sounds, the creak of a floorboard, the closing of a distant door, the shuffle of footsteps along a hotel corridor. Where once she would have laughed at such things, she now fell into silence, her eyes fixed on empty spaces as though listening for something only she could hear. Her husband reassured her tirelessly. He told her that no mysterious man lurked in their rooms, that ghosts were for storytellers and restless children, not for grown women of sound sense. Yet, even as he spoke, he could not shake the memory of that fleeting glimpse, the tall figure they had seen in the hotel vestibule on the night of her first dream. The man's sharp profile had been unmistakable, and though it could easily be coincidence, the recognition in Elizabeth's eyes had been immediate, too quick, too fierce, as though she were staring not at a stranger, but at a pursuer she already knew. They left Brussels with a curious relief, as though distance alone could protect them. Their journey took them down the Rhine, where the river curled through green banks and ancient castles loomed like watchful sentinels above the water. The scenery was peaceful, even majestic, but Elizabeth's nerves remained taut, strung as tight as the strings of a violin, stretched nearly to snapping. She clung to her husband's arm, when crossing from deck to cabin, startled at the slightest brush of another passenger's coat. When asked what troubled her, she hesitated, then answered in a whisper that she feared seeing the man again, not merely in dreams, but in waking life, standing close enough for her to feel his breath. Her husband urged her to stay rational, to remind herself that dreams do not walk into daylight. Elizabeth nodded, but her pale face betrayed her disbelief. "I know what I saw," she said finally, her voice trembling. "He was there, not imagined, not dreamed. He looked at me as though he expected me to rise and follow him, as though I belonged to him." At that, her husband wrapped his arm around her and held her until the shivering in her shoulders quieted. But in his own mind, unease stirred like sediment rising in water. Elizabeth was impressionable, certainly, but never a liar, and fear had etched itself too deeply into her voice to be dismissed as mere nervousness. They traveled on, stopping at small towns whose narrow streets smelled of freshly baked bread and drying linen. Children played along riverbanks, and innkeepers greeted them with warm cheer. But each time they settled into a new room, Elizabeth would walk the perimeter slowly, pressing her hand against the window latch, checking beneath the bed, stepping back to study the door as though testing the strength of its lock. Her husband teased her at first, gently, hoping humor would ease her worry, but she never laughed. She only murmured something about how easily locks could be opened by determined hands. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky glowed in shades of violet and rose, they strolled along a quiet riverside path. The water reflected the fading light like a great sheet of molten metal, and the air was cool and fragrant with early night. For a time, Elizabeth seemed calmer. The tranquility of the evening, the rhythm of the river, and the comfort of her husband's presence smoothed the sharp edges of her fear. She leaned her head against his shoulder and spoke of their future homes they might choose, gardens she wished to plant, the hope of children someday. Her voice grew distant, dreamy, as though imagining those possibilities allowed her to drift, if only briefly, out of the shadowed world that haunted her sleep. But then she stopped, mid-sentence. Her hand tightened around his. Slowly, she turned her head, looking past him toward a narrow street that led back into the town. Her husband followed her gaze, expecting to see a passer-by or a vendor closing up shop. Instead, he saw only the empty path. Yet Elizabeth's face had gone white as paper. She swallowed hard, unable to speak, then clutched his arm and urged him to return to the hotel immediately. Only after they reached their room, only after the door was bolted, and after she sat trembling on the edge of the bed, did she finally confess what she had seen: the man with the nose, standing at the corner of the street, watching her, his silhouette frozen, his face turned toward her as though carved from the very dusk itself. Her husband tried to reassure her, to tell her it must have been someone else, a resemblance, a trick of the evening light. But she insisted it was him, and in her desperation there was something new, less terror now, and more dread, like someone who realizes a chase has not merely resumed, but never stopped at all. When night fell, she lay beside her husband but did not sleep. Each time her eyelids fluttered shut, she would jerk awake, fearing she might drift back into the realm where the man's silent command awaited her. She feared not only his presence, but the power he seemed to hold over her, the way her breath quickened at the thought of him, the way her mind reeled with fragments she could not explain. Was it merely the mesmeric incident revived from memory, or something else, something reaching from a past she barely understood? Her husband held her hand throughout the night, whispering soothing words, promising that morning would bring reason back to her thoughts. Yet as the hours passed and moonlight crept across the room, his own certainty wavered. A strange sensation clung to the air, as though they were not entirely alone. Once or twice he thought he heard a faint sound from the hallway, a light step, a shifting weight, maybe the slow turning of a door handle. But when he rose to check, the corridor was empty. Under the silver glow of the moon, one truth became harder and harder to ignore. Whatever haunted Elizabeth was drawing nearer. not because she sought it, but because it sought her. And somewhere in the shadows of that foreign city, a silent figure with a sharply cut nose might have paused beneath a lamp-post, watching their window, waiting for the moment when fear would open a door reason could no longer hold shut. Morning came pale and thin, as though the sun itself hesitated to cross the threshold of their window. Elizabeth had slept only in short, trembling snatches of dreams, while her husband watched over her with a growing heaviness in his chest. The occurrences of the previous night clung to the air like a fine frost. Nothing had happened, strictly speaking, yet both felt as though something had, as though an invisible presence had passed through the room while they were too afraid to acknowledge it. Elizabeth insisted she was well enough to continue their travels, though the fragile timbre of her voice betrayed her. She dressed with careful movements, avoiding the mirror by the window, as though expecting to see not herself, but the reflection of that silent figure beside her. Her husband attempted gentle conversation over breakfast, but she scarcely touched her food, pushing a piece of bread back and forth across her plate as if her mind had drifted miles beyond the little dining room. They decided to leave that town at once, choosing a steamer that would take them farther down the river. The morning air was crisp, almost invigorating, and for a moment her husband believed the change might do her good. Travelers bustled about the quay, children ran along the planks, and the low hum of the boat's machinery prepared for departure. It was a scene of life and light, one that ought to dispel the shadows of the night before. But even here, Elizabeth seemed always to be listening for footsteps that did not belong, watching for a silhouette that should not be present. Each time a tall stranger passed, she stiffened. Each time someone's gaze lingered on her too long, she shifted closer to her husband. The world around her had transformed into a maze of potential threats. Once aboard, they secured a small cabin. Elizabeth settled near the window, staring out at the rolling banks of green that drifted by. For a while she seemed calmer, soothed by the rhythm of the river and the beat of the paddle wheels. Her husband considered reading aloud to her, perhaps some travel guide or a passage of poetry, but before he could suggest it, she spoke softly. "Do you ever feel," she murmured, without looking at him, "that something is near you, even when you cannot see it?" He hesitated. "Sometimes, but usually only when my mind is already occupied with something unsettling." Elizabeth nodded slowly, as though this confirmed a thought she had been harboring. "I felt him last night," she said. "Not in a dream, not with my eyes, but I knew he was close, as if he were waiting for the moment I was weakest." Her husband's heart tightened, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Elizabeth, it was a dream influenced by your memories of the mesmerist. Your mind is filled with impressions you do not fully understand." She turned to him then, her eyes wide and haunted. "But you heard something, too. I saw it in your face when you returned from the door." He faltered, caught between honesty and the wish to shield her. "Old buildings always make strange noises," he replied gently, "and fear makes them seem louder." Elizabeth pressed her fingers together as though trying to steady them. "No," she whispered. "It wasn't the building. It was him." As the boat cut through the river's smooth surface, the incident might have faded beneath the warmth of sunlight had not something happened just before noon. Elizabeth had stepped out onto the deck for air while her husband arranged their belongings. When he joined her, he found her rigid, her hand gripping the railing until her knuckles blanched. She did not turn when he approached. He followed her gaze. Across the riverbank, far beyond the reach of any clear detail, a solitary man stood near the edge of a path, tall, motionless, and unmistakably watching the steamer. The distance made it impossible to see his face, but something in the angle of his stance, the way his shoulders aligned, the outline of his head, something struck him with cold familiarity. For a moment, he felt Elizabeth's terror pulse through him like an electric spark. But then the steamer shifted, rounding a bend, and the figure disappeared behind a curtain of trees. Elizabeth exhaled sharply, as though she had been drowning and only now found air. Her husband tried to convince himself that the man had simply been a passer-by, a traveler pausing to observe the boat. There were hundreds of such figures along the length of the Rhine-men, pausing to smoke, to watch, to rest. Yet the way Elizabeth trembled told him she believed otherwise. And for the first time, he wondered whether the man's appearance, if it was indeed the same man, might not be coincidence. Still, reason offered its arguments. The world was wide, travelers numerous, and memory notoriously unreliable, especially when fevered by fear. He rested his hand over hers, guiding her gently back toward the cabin. But Elizabeth resisted, turning back one last time to peer through the thinning trees, searching for a final glimpse of the figure who had unsettled her soul. The remainder of the journey passed uneasily. Elizabeth remained near the window, but each glance toward the shore seemed weighted with the dread of seeing him again. Her husband sat beside her, pretending to read, though his eyes often drifted to her pale, strained profile. More than once, she startled at the sound of another passenger walking past their door, and as evening approached, her anxiety heightened. They disembarked in a larger town, choosing a well-regarded hotel for the night. The establishment was bright, bustling, filled with other tourists, yet somehow the liveliness felt brittle. Perhaps it was the echoing corridors, or the way shadows gathered in the folds of the draperies, or simply the fact that Elizabeth's fear had begun to infiltrate even her husband's imagination. As they walked toward the staircase, Elizabeth suddenly stopped. Her husband turned to her, puzzled. She was staring at the far end of the hallway. The corridor was long and carpeted in deep burgundy, lined with brass lamps that cast puddles of golden light. And within one of those pools of light, standing absolutely still, like a figure left behind after the world had moved, was a man, tall, dark, unmoving. The hallway was too distant for them to see his features, yet Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat with a faint, strangled sound. Her husband blinked. A group of travelers passed between them and the figure, and when the view cleared, he was gone, completely vanished, as though he had never stood there at all. Elizabeth clutched his arm, her voice cracking with an anguish that pierced straight through him. "You saw him," she whispered. "You saw him this time." He opened his mouth to deny it, to reason it away, but the words would not come, for he had seen something, perhaps a shadow, perhaps a man, but it had been there, and now it was gone. A strange silence settled between them as they continued up the stairs, a silence filled not with comfort, but with the realization that something was unfolding beyond their understanding. Whether the man was real or not no longer mattered. What mattered was the tightening sense that he was drawing closer, step by silent step, following them from one town to the next, watching, waiting, and whatever he wanted from Elizabeth, he intended to claim. The hours that followed were strangely heavy, as though the air of the hotel were thickened with the unspoken fear that both Elizabeth and her husband carried within them. Though they tried to behave naturally, asking for hot water, sorting their luggage, making polite remarks about the view from the window, every gesture felt strained. Beneath every word, beneath every breath, lay the haunting memory of the man in the corridor, the man who had disappeared without a trace, as though he had been carved from shadow and dissolved back into it. Elizabeth's husband told himself that he must remain strong. For her sake, whatever she believed she had seen, whatever madness or coincidence had taken hold of her senses, he must be her anchor. But as the night settled into the quiet corners of the hotel, as footsteps faded from the hallways and lamps were turned down one by one, he found himself listening with a vigilance he had not admitted even to himself. Each creak of the floor above them made him pause. Each gust of wind rattling the window pane stirred a flicker of unease in his chest. Elizabeth, however, was long past the stage of quiet dread. She had entered a different realm of terror entirely, one that left no room for doubt. Her nerves, already stretched thin, seemed now to vibrate at the slightest disturbance. She sat near the fire, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, as if cold seeped from the very walls. Her face was drawn, her eyes dark with exhaustion, her breath shallow and uneven. Her husband tried to coax her into bed, hoping sleep would offer some relief. She shook her head quickly, almost violently, whispering, "I can't sleep. If I sleep, he'll come back. He waits for that." She said it not with hysteria, but with a conviction so calm it chilled him more than any outburst could have. He expressed disbelief gently, urging her to reason, reminding her that no human being could simply appear and vanish so effortlessly, that the mind often creates ghosts where there are none. But she interrupted him with a trembling voice. "He is not a ghost. That is what terrifies me most. He is real, real enough to follow, real enough to find me no matter where I go." Her words echoed in the room like a soft lament. The fire crackled, the shadows on the walls swayed in uneasy patterns, and her husband realized he could no longer dismiss her fears as mere imagination. Not after what he had seen, not after the figure in the corridor who had vanished before his eyes. At last, exhausted by fear, Elizabeth lay down on the bed. Her husband remained awake in the chair beside her, determined to stand guard. He watched her eyelids flutter, watched her breathing slow, watched the tension in her limbs loosen. For a moment, he believed she might finally find rest. But then, she stirred. A small, strangled sound escaped her. Her hand twitched, her lips parted, her forehead tightened, as though she were trying to resist some unseen force pulling her deeper into sleep. Her husband leaned forward, calling her name softly, but she did not respond. Instead, she murmured something unintelligible, a sound both pleading and fearful. He rose immediately and shook her gently, calling louder, "Elizabeth, wake up! Wake up!" But her eyes remained shut, moving rapidly beneath the lids, as though she were watching something unfold before her. Her breathing quickened, her hands clutched at the bedspread, and suddenly she whispered, with a clarity that froze him where he stood, "He's here." Her husband felt every hair on his body rise. He glanced around the room, though every corner appeared empty, every shadow still. But Elizabeth's voice quiet, certain held a truth he could not ignore. He shook her again, more urgently. "Elizabeth, open your eyes. You're dreaming." But she only murmured in agony, "No, he is calling me." Her husband's heart pounded. He knelt beside her, took her cold hand in his, and spoke with desperate firmness. "You are safe here. No one is calling you. Wake up." Yet even as he said the words, he felt the room tighten, as though some invisible thread had been pulled taut between their world and another. Elizabeth's breathing grew ragged. Her body arched slightly, as though she were being drawn upward by unseen hands. Her husband held her shoulders, trying to keep her anchored to the bed. "Elizabeth!" he cried, his voice breaking. "Wake up. You must wake up." At last, with a sudden gasp, her eyes snapped open. She looked around wildly, her chest heaving, her hair clinging damply to her temples. When her gaze met his, the terror inside her seemed to spill over into fresh tears. She clung to him, trembling uncontrollably, burying her face in his shoulder as though to escape whatever she had seen. "It was him," she whispered between sobs. "He told me to come. He said I belonged to him. He said I would follow him whether I wished it or not." Her husband held her closer, trying to steady her shaking form. "It was only a nightmare," he insisted, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "No," she breathed. "It was not a nightmare. It was him." She would not return to sleep after that. She insisted on sitting upright by the fire, clutching his hand with a grip that suggested she feared she might be dragged away the moment she released him. Her husband remained beside her, his presence a shield against the invisible threat she felt closing in. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Outside the window, the night deepened into a profound stillness, broken only by the distant tolling of a church bell announcing the hour. Then, so faintly he almost doubted he heard it, a sound reached them from the hallway. A footstep, slow, deliberate, moving along the corridor outside their door. Elizabeth stiffened. Her fingers dug into his hand. Her eyes widened in fresh terror. Another footstep. Her husband rose and moved toward the door, though every instinct in him rebelled against the idea. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. Then, very softly, a whisper of fabric, as though someone brushed past their door. A presence that lingered for a moment, that breathed against the other side of the wall, that waited. Elizabeth's voice came in a cracked whisper. "He has found me." Her husband backed away from the door, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest like a stone. He extinguished the last of the fire, darkening the room, as if the shadow inside might protect them from the shadow outside. But as the minutes passed, as the silence returned, as Elizabeth clung to him with frozen fingers, they both understood something neither dared to voice. The man with the terrible, unmistakable nose had not been left behind on any riverbank or corridor. He had followed them here, and he would follow again. The next morning dawned reluctantly, as though even the sun felt some hesitation in piercing the dense, uneasy atmosphere that had settled over their room. Elizabeth had not slept at all, nor had her husband. They sat together in the heavy silence of the early hours, both exhausted, yet neither willing to close their eyes for fear that sleep might open the door to something far worse. When the first weak light slipped through the curtains, it brought no comfort, only the realization that daylight could not banish what followed them. Elizabeth's husband insisted they leave the hotel at once. He felt a growing urgency, a need to remove her from the place where pain, fear, and sleeplessness had trapped her in a grip of trembling dread. He could not fully articulate why, but he sensed that remaining another night would be disastrous. So they packed their belongings quickly, avoiding the corridor where the footsteps had sounded, and descended to the common room where morning activity resumed with careless cheer. Breakfast clattered in dishes, travelers chatted brightly, and children ran between tables with joyous laughter. To anyone else, the hotel looked perfectly ordinary, but to Elizabeth, every doorway seemed to conceal a threat. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, and each time a tall man entered the room, even if nothing at all resembled the figure she feared, her breath hitched. Her husband guided her toward a secluded table, promising they would leave soon. He ordered tea, though Elizabeth could not bring herself to drink it. She barely touched her cup. Her trembling hands made it shake against the saucer. After a few minutes, he rose to settle the bill and arrange for a carriage. When he returned, he found Elizabeth's face drained of color. At first, he feared the man had appeared again. But when he followed her gaze, he saw nothing unusual, only a waiter laying out fresh plates on a nearby table. Elizabeth clutched his arm and whispered. He was there, standing in the doorway, only for a moment, watching me. Her husband knew better than to dismiss this, but he also knew they needed to leave immediately before fear shattered her entirely. He urged her to rise, and together they left the bustling room, moving through the foyer as though escaping a burning building. Once outside, the cool air revived Elizabeth slightly. She breathed deeply, her eyes fluttering closed, as though the gentle breeze were the first kind touch she had felt in days. The carriage arrived, and they climbed in, grateful for its shelter. As the horses pulled them away from the hotel, Elizabeth leaned into her husband with a small sigh of relief. But relief, in her case, had become something fleeting, for though the hotel receded behind them, though the morning brightened, though the road stretched forward with no trace of danger, Elizabeth could not escape the feeling that the man remained close, not behind them, not beside them, but everywhere at once, like a stain imprinted on the very air she breathed. The carriage journey brought them to a small railway station where they intended to catch a train toward a more populated region, hoping the movement and noise might help dispel the ominous quiet that had followed them from place to place. While waiting on the platform, they settled onto a bench, and Elizabeth wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Her husband attempted idle conversation, speaking of trivial matters, the architecture of the towns they passed, the curious customs of travelers they had met, anything that might lift her mind from the oppressive shadow that clung to her. But Elizabeth barely heard him. Her gaze wandered constantly over the rails, the waiting passengers, the station doors. She seemed almost like a hunted animal, alert to the slightest motion. Several times she gripped his hand suddenly, saying she saw the man's silhouette between the moving crowds. Each time her husband turned, the space was empty. Finally, the train arrived with a shriek of metal and a cloud of steam that engulfed the platform. They boarded quickly. The interior was warm and polished, with soft seats and brass fixtures that gleamed under the lamps. It was the sort of comfortable, orderly railway car that should have soothed Elizabeth, but instead, the enclosed space seemed to tighten the walls around her. They chose a compartment with a window view. Elizabeth sat closest to it, staring out at the shifting scenes as the train began its steady movement. Fields rolled past, then small villages, then stretches of forest where the trees pressed close to the tracks like a dark audience. With every mile, the world blurred, yet Elizabeth remained tense. Her husband tried to distract her by recalling lighter memories from their early courtship, making gentle jokes, reminding her of times when her laughter had filled the room like a bright melody. And for a moment, just a moment, her lips curved into a faint smile. It was a fragile thing, but it was something. But the moment shattered the instant the train slowed for a brief stop at a wayside platform. As the carriage windows aligned with the station, Elizabeth suddenly stiffened. Her eyes widened. Her breath stopped. Her husband followed her gaze. There, on the platform, standing perfectly still among the blur of moving passengers, was a man. His figure was tall, cloaked in a dark coat, and though the window pane distorted his features slightly, there was no mistaking the jut of his nose, the slant of his brow, the unnatural stillness of his posture. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. A strangled gasp escaped her. "It's him," she whispered. Her husband blinked, and in the next instant, the train lurched forward once more. The man's figure blurred, then disappeared behind a column. "Elizabeth," he said urgently, gripping her shoulders, "you must listen to me. Even if it was him, even if he cannot follow us by train at every stopping place, this is impossible, logistically impossible." But Elizabeth only shook her head. Her voice was barely audible, but the horror within it was unmistakable. "He always finds a way." The train thundered onward, carrying them away from the station, but the memory of that still figure remained etched inside them. It was not merely that he had appeared, it was the assumption behind his presence, that he knew their route, that he had anticipated where they would go next, that he could arrive before they reached each place. Her husband tried to reason with himself, clinging to logic as though it were a lifeline. Perhaps the man was simply another traveler who happened to share their direction. Perhaps a series of coincidences had been woven into a frightening pattern by Elizabeth's fragile nerves. But deep inside, something colder whispered a different truth. This was no coincidence. This was pursuit. And as the train carried them toward whatever came next, her husband realized with a chilling certainty that the man with the terrible, unmistakable nose was not merely following Elizabeth. He was closing in. He was drawing nearer. And whatever force bound him to her, whatever dark fascination or mesmeric power he held, was far from spent. The train journey pressed onward through the late afternoon, and though the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails usually lulled passengers into comfortable reflection, it offered Elizabeth no such peace. She sat rigid, as though some invisible thread pulled her upright, holding her in a posture of waiting for the next appearance, the next whisper of danger. Her husband watched her with growing unease, unable to ignore the way her gaze flicked constantly toward the window, as if she expected the man's face to materialize in the passing landscape. He tried to draw her into conversation again, but she responded only in short, distracted phrases. The brief smile she had shown earlier seemed like a distant memory. Fear had sunk into her like frost into stone, hardening every expression. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers entwined so firmly that her knuckles appeared white. As dusk began to fall, the train's lamps flickered to life, casting a soft yellow glow that swayed gently with the movement of the carriage. Outside, the world darkened into silhouettes, clusters of trees, rolling fields, and the occasional house, whose windows shone faintly like distant stars. Darkness, once a familiar comfort, now deepened Elizabeth's dread. Her husband suggested they try to rest, or at least close their eyes for a little while. The strain of sleepless nights was beginning to show on her face, and he feared what exhaustion might do to her already fragile mind. After a long hesitation, Elizabeth finally leaned her head against his shoulder, though her posture remained taut, as if her body refused to surrender fully to repose. Yet exhaustion is a stronger master than fear. Bit by bit, her rigid form slackened, her breathing steadied, her fingers loosened around his sleeve. She slipped into a light, uneasy sleep. It was only minutes before he noticed the change. At first, it was subtle, a faint twitch in her eyelids, the slight tremble of her hands. Then her breath grew shallow, uneven. Her brow creased, as though reacting to some internal struggle. Her lips parted, forming silent shapes that seemed to echo a conversation he could not hear. "Elizabeth," he whispered, touching her cheek gently. "Wake up." She did not stir. Her head tilted slightly, her expression becoming one of pained resignation, as though she were being compelled to answer someone. Then, in a voice so soft he barely caught the words, she murmured, "Yes, I hear you." A chill ran through him. He shook her shoulder lightly. "Elizabeth, it's just a dream. Wake up." But she was somewhere else entirely. Her lips moved again. "I am coming. Don't take me yet. Please." Her husband felt dread settle into the pit of his stomach. "Elizabeth," he urged, shaking her more firmly. "You must wake up now." But her body grew strangely still, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes moved rapidly beneath her closed lids, as though following someone across a dimly lit room. Her husband leaned closer, trembling now with fear he could no longer deny. Then her voice, stronger and more anguished, broke through the hum of the train. Leave me, please, I did not call you." Her husband felt his heart stop for a beat. There was no mistaking the terror in her tone. She was not speaking to a phantom conjured by memory. She was answering someone she believed was truly in the room with them. He grasped her shoulders, shaking her hard. "Elizabeth, you are safe. Open your eyes." But she resisted, as though caught in invisible bindings. Her body arched slightly, her fingers curling into claws that scratched at the seat beside her. "He is here," she whispered, her voice drenched with despair. "He stands beside you. He is watching me." Her husband froze. For a long moment, he could not turn. Some primal instinct told him not to. Every hair on his neck lifted, and his breath seized in his chest. The compartment felt suddenly colder, the air thick with a tension that seemed to pulse and breathe. But when he forced himself to look slowly, painfully, there was nothing there, only shadows swaying with the lantern. He turned back to her, gripping her hands. "Elizabeth, listen to my voice. There is no one here, only you and me. Wake up!" At last, with a shudder that shook her from head to toe, her eyes flew open. She gasped as though surfacing from deep water, clutching for air. Her husband wrapped his arms around her as she trembled uncontrollably. Tears streaked down her cheeks, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "It was him," she whispered. "Not a dream. He called me. He said I belonged to him. He told me I must obey." Her husband held her tighter, though he felt more helpless than ever. "You are safe. No one will take you." But even as he said the words, a dread certainty seeped into him. Something had happened while she slept, something that reached beyond the mere terror of nightmares. The sense of presence she'd spoken of was more than imagination. The chill in the compartment, the tightening in the air, they had felt real to him as well. And yet, the train was full of passengers, full of attendants, full of life. How could such a presence slip undetected into a crowded carriage? Elizabeth pressed her hands to her temples. "He wants me to follow him," she whispered. "He said I will come to him in the end, whether I wish to or not." Her husband tried to reason with her, tried to insist that this was the lingering effect of her mesmerism years ago, that her mind was replaying experiences she had never truly understood. But Elizabeth shook her head weakly. "This is not memory," she said. "This is happening." The train plunged into a tunnel then, and for an instant, total darkness swallowed them. The lamps flickered. The air felt tight, compressed, suffocating. Elizabeth whimpered, her hand flying to her mouth, as if to stifle a scream. Her husband felt an oppressive weight settle in the compartment, a pressure that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. And in that smothering darkness, he had the eerie sensation that someone else was standing there, someone tall, silent, close enough to touch, if only they dared to reach into the blackness. Just as Elizabeth's breath began to hitch in panic, the train burst back into the open night. Light returned in trembling flickers. The pressure lifted, but Elizabeth had curled against her husband, her entire body shaking. "It will not stop," she murmured. "He will not stop until I am his." Her husband stroked her hair, whispering soothing words he no longer believed. For the first time, he wondered if there existed any distance far enough, any place hidden enough, any refuge strong enough to keep the man with the terrible nose away from her. And deep inside, he feared the answer was no. Morning crept across the sky with a pale, watery light that seemed too delicate to belong to the world Elizabeth now inhabited. The train had reached its destination, and her husband insisted they take a carriage to their hotel without delay. He hoped rest might soothe her trembling nerves. Yet even beneath blankets, even with her head leaning against his shoulder, Elizabeth seemed to shrink into herself, as though afraid that sunlight might cast a shadow shaped like the figure who haunted her dreams. She remained unusually quiet as they arrived at the Hotel des Quatre Saisons in Wiesbaden. The hotel, proud and orderly beneath the soft glow of gas lamps, appeared the very image of safety. Guests chatted on the steps. Porters hurried past with trunks. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. But as the carriage slowed, Elizabeth straightened abruptly, her breath catching. Her husband felt her hand convulse around his. "Elizabeth? What is it?" Her lips parted. A strangled sound escaped her. Then she screamed, a long, piercing cry that tore through the quiet street. He had never heard a sound like it, not even from her deepest night terrors. He followed the direction of her trembling finger and saw a tall figure standing half in shadow beneath the hotel lights. The fleeting glimpse revealed nothing more than the outline of a man, dark coat, straight posture, a stillness too deliberate to be natural. And just as quickly, he vanished into the night. Elizabeth collapsed into her husband's arms. Her body went limp, heavy with a faintness that seemed born not from weakness, but from sheer terror. The bystanders gasped, rushing forward with offers of assistance. But her husband lifted her himself, carrying her quickly into the hotel. Inside, the warmth of the hall contrasted sharply with the icy chill still clinging to her skin. Her maid, Morris, had been waiting anxiously and nearly cried with relief as they laid Elizabeth gently onto a sofa. The maid pressed cool cloths to her forehead while her husband urged calm words into her ear, though he felt his own heart hammering chaotically. After nearly an hour, Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze darted wildly across the room until it found her husband. A shudder rippled through her entire frame. "He was here," she whispered. "You saw him. Tell me you saw him." He hesitated. He had seen someone, yes, but only for a heartbeat, and yet the terror in her voice made denying it impossible. "I saw a man," he said carefully, "but only for a moment. It was likely a passerby, someone who—" "No," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "Not a passerby. It was him, the same man, the man from the dream." Her husband tried to offer rational explanations: trick of light, exhaustion, imagination fed by fear, but Elizabeth shook her head with a stubborn, trembling certainty. "He looked at me," she whispered, "the same way he did in the room, as if I belonged to him." Her breath hitched, and tears pricked her eyes, but she wiped them fiercely away, as though crying might somehow give the shadow more power. The next morning, Her husband set out, determined to uncover the truth. He questioned the hotel staff, describing the man in calm, measured language, attempting to sound unconcerned. But the results were unsettling. Most attendants shook their heads, but then one young waiter paused, his brow wrinkling thoughtfully. "Yes," he said at last. "There was a tall, dark gentleman here last night, a very peculiar nose, easily remembered. He left early, at first light." Her husband's stomach dropped. "Did he leave a name?" "No, monsieur. He did not sign the registry." "And where did he go?" "That I cannot say." The waiter's voice was apologetic, but there was nothing more to offer. No name, no origin, no destination. Only the bare bones of a sighting that confirmed Elizabeth's fear more than it soothed it. Upon returning to their room, he found Elizabeth awake, sitting upright in bed, clasping her hands so tightly her nails left little crescents in her palms. She listened to the news with wide, troubled eyes. "He left because he found me," she whispered. "He knows where I am now." "That is nonsense," her husband insisted, though even his tone lacked conviction. "He left because he had some trivial business elsewhere. Elizabeth, we cannot build terrors out of coincidence." But Elizabeth was no longer hearing him. Her gaze drifted toward the balcony curtains, which fluttered gently in the summer breeze. Yet there was nothing gentle in her stare. Her eyes held the same haunted distance they had after her nightmare, as though she saw something beyond the physical world. "He could follow us anywhere," she murmured. "Even across countries, even across oceans." "Elizabeth," he said firmly, "we will not live in fear of shadows. Whatever this man wants, he will find no welcome here, and whatever power you believe he holds over you, it ends today." But even as he spoke the words, a cold realization pressed inward. He had no idea how to end this. He had no enemy to confront, no name to curse, no trail to follow. He had only the shape of a man and the echo of dread left behind wherever that shape appeared. The following days passed uneasily. They continued their travels, though the joyful spirit that had once carried them was gone. Each new town, each new hotel, seemed to Elizabeth another stage upon which the unknown figure might appear at any moment. She clung to her husband's arm more tightly than before. She startled at shadows. She slept poorly, and on those rare nights she did slip into deeper slumber. She awoke with her own cries. The man with the terrible nose never appeared again, not in physical form, not in the flicker of a lamplight or the corner of a mirror, but Elizabeth felt him everywhere. She claimed she could sense him, just out of sight, just out of reach, waiting with a patience that felt more threatening than any chase. Her husband attempted to soothe her with letters from friends, charming countryside distractions, and gentle conversation. Yet nothing settled the knot of dread tightening inside her. Fear had taken root, and once rooted, it was as stubborn as ivy. One night, as they lay in a quiet room, overlooking a lake, glowing faintly beneath moonlight, Elizabeth whispered, "It will not end, will it?" Her husband squeezed her hand. "Yes, it will." But she only looked at him sadly, as though she already knew something he did not, something he feared to learn, something that, in time, he would come to understand all too well. The morning sun rose warm and golden over the quiet countryside, its rays falling gently across the breakfast table where Elizabeth, her husband, and Jane Watson sat. Yet the brightness of the day did nothing to lift the lingering heaviness that clung to Elizabeth's thoughts. Though she smiled politely and attempted to eat, her appetite was faint, and shadows bloomed beneath her eyes, shadows not cast by the sun, but by fear. Jane and her husband, Robin, had listened attentively as Elizabeth recounted the strange terror that had plagued her travels. They were sympathetic, concerned even, but neither seemed ready to accept the dark thread of otherworldliness woven into her tale. To them, the world was still firmly grounded in reason, fields, harvests, and daily duties. But Elizabeth felt, more strongly with every passing hour, that reason alone was no longer enough to explain what followed her. Trying to dispel the tension at the table, Robin suggested a walk through his farmlands. Fresh air, he declared, with his practical cheerfulness, makes all ghosts, real or imagined, scatter like crows. Elizabeth did not believe him, but she also did not have the strength to argue. Her husband squeezed her hand gently, urging her to join them, and so, with a lingering unease, she agreed. The day was, indeed, beautiful fields of wheat bent gracefully under the warmth of late summer, and the sky stretched blue and cloudless overhead. Birds drifted lazily from hedgerow to hedgerow, and in the distance came the rhythmic sound of harvest work, scythes cutting, rakes gathering, laughter rising between men as they paused for drink. It was a scene of pure, rustic peace. Elizabeth looked around and wished desperately she could feel the serenity that lay so easily upon everything else. As they walked, Robin spoke of his land, the crops, the laborers, and the promise of a good harvest. He described each field as though it were a chapter in a beloved book, and despite her turmoil, Elizabeth found comfort in the simplicity of his grounded enthusiasm. It was a world where problems could be weighed, measured, and solved, so unlike the invisible terror that clung to her life. After nearly an hour, they reached a wide, open field where workers rested along the hedge during their midday meal. The sun was at its zenith, and the air shimmered with heat. Elizabeth's husband, noticing her fatigue, suggested they pause in the shade. She nodded gratefully, though her eyes remained fixed on the men. Something in the back of her mind stirred, a whisper of recognition she didn't understand. Robin led them toward the resting harvesters, cheerfully greeting the men as they approached. The workers, sprawled across the grass, looked up with easy smiles, lifting their hats in greeting. Their rough faces were browned by sun, their clothes worn from labor. One by one, Elizabeth studied them, feeling a strange trembling grow beneath her ribs. Each face was human, unmistakably real, and yet a sensation struck her like a hand closing around her throat. Her breath failed, her vision blurred, her heart beat in a frantic staccato, and then she saw him, sitting only a few yards away, slicing crusty bread with a clasp knife, a small heap of coarse bacon at his feet. The nose, the eyes, small, cunning, sly, the same coarse hair, the same twisted mouth, the same face, the exact same face that had peered at her through the veil of her nightmares and stood at the foot of her bed, commanding her forward with a silent and wicked authority. Her body turned to stone, her lips parted in horror. She tried to speak, but only managed a strangled breath. Her husband felt her grip tighten on his arm with a strength he didn't know she possessed. He turned, startled, and saw her staring, frozen, at the harvesters. "Elizabeth?" he whispered. She could not answer. She raised one trembling hand and pointed slowly, with terrible certainty, to the man near the end of the row. Her husband followed her gaze, confusion flickering across his face. To him, the man appeared like any other, laborer, sunburned, dusty, tired. But as Elizabeth's trembling rose, he felt something cold slide through him. Robin looked from one to the other, his cheerful curiosity giving way to concern. "Is everything all right?" Her husband swallowed. "Elizabeth thinks she recognizes someone." Elizabeth managed to speak at last, though her voice broke with each syllable. "That man. There. Him. I saw him. In my dream. In the hotel. He has followed us." Robin blinked. Then he laughed gently, misunderstanding. "My dear lady, these Irish fellows come over in droves during harvest. They resemble each other, rugged faces, dark hair, rough manner. You are mistaking one for another." "No!" Elizabeth cried, louder than she intended. "There is no mistake. I would know him anywhere." Her husband studied the laborer again, but the man continued eating, seemingly unaware of the commotion he'd caused. When he eventually felt their eyes on him, he looked up briefly, and in that brief moment, Elizabeth's breath left her body. It was the same sneering glance from her dream, the same dark gleam that had frozen her in place. Even the faint movement of his jaw as he chewed invoked a memory that made her stomach twist. This was no coincidence. This was no illusion. This was the man. Robin frowned, the laughter fading from his lips. He looked more carefully now, though he still seemed unconvinced. "Are you absolutely certain, Elizabeth? These men?" "He is the one," she whispered. "The one who took her. The one who called me. He is the same." Her husband placed a protective arm around her. "We should go." But Elizabeth could not move. Her legs refused to obey. It felt as though the earth held her in place, forcing her to face the horror she had tried to escape. The harvester's chatter faded into distant noise as she stared at the man whose presence had torn through her life like a storm. She saw something else then, not just recognition on his face, but something colder, something deliberate. He looked at her too long, too knowingly, and a faint, crooked smile tugged at one corner of his mouth, as though he enjoyed her fear. Robin, now uneasy, stepped forward. "Let's return to the house. It's too hot out here." At last, Elizabeth managed to turn away. Her husband guided her, half carrying her as they walked from the field. Each step felt like moving through water, thick and resistant. Only when they reached the shade of the trees did she find her breath again. "You saw him now," she whispered hoarsely to her husband. "Tell me you believe me." He hesitated only for a heartbeat, but it was enough for her to feel the old dread return. "Elizabeth," he murmured, "I don't know what to believe." She looked back across the shimmering field, where the workers still lounged in the brightness of midday. The man had resumed eating, appearing as ordinary as the rest. But Elizabeth knew some horrors disguise themselves in daylight. Some demons wield nothing but a human face, and some destinies, once marked, refuse to be undone. Despite the oppressive heat of midday, a sudden chill clung to Elizabeth long after they left the harvest field. She walked between her husband and Jane Watson as though navigating a world that no longer obeyed familiar laws. The trees above rustled softly, their shadows dappling the dusty path, but the breeze did nothing to loosen the knot of dread coiled inside her chest. Everything she had feared, everything she had tried to suppress under reassurances and reason, had stepped into the daylight with a human face. All the whispers in her sleep, all the visions that had tormented her, had taken form in the one man she had prayed she would never see again. Jane kept speaking in her gentle, practical manner about the walk, the sun, the workers, anything to keep Elizabeth calm, but Elizabeth hardly heard her. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, the man's eyes lifting, the unmistakable glint of recognition, the mocking curve of his mouth. Not a stranger, not a dream, not a phantom conjured by sleepless terror. A man who had been in her room, in her dreams, in her nightmares, and now, in the bright open field, as though he belonged there. They reached the house at last. The Watsons' home, usually warm and lively, seemed strangely subdued. Maybe it was Elizabeth's trembling silence, or the way her husband hovered protectively at her side, ushering her inside with a tenderness edged in desperation. He led her to the drawing room, where Morris rushed to bring cold water and smelling salts. Elizabeth sat on a settee, clutching a pillow as though it were an anchor in a sea of madness. But Elizabeth was not mad. She had seen him. She knew him. Her husband paced the room in short, agitated steps. Jane stood by the window, her worry clear, though she tried to hide it beneath a facade of calm. Elizabeth watched the movement silently, feeling her strength ebb. It was Jane who finally spoke softly. "Elizabeth, my dear, this is fear playing tricks on the mind. That laborer, he is merely one of the men hired for the harvest. Thousands look like him." Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "No, they do not. I would know him even in the dark, even if I could see nothing but the shape of his shadow." Her husband stopped pacing. "Elizabeth, you must rest. This is all connected to your distress of the past weeks. You have had nightmares, hallucinations." "They were not hallucinations," she whispered. "They were warnings." Jane exchanged a worried glance with him. He sat beside Elizabeth, taking her shaking hands in his. "Then tell me everything, exactly as it has happened, every detail." So Elizabeth did. She told them of the terrible dream from days before, when the man with the terrible nose had appeared inside the house where Jane and Robin now lived. She described moving silently through their rooms at night, guided not by her own will but by an unseen force. She described how she had seen Jane and Robin asleep, unaware of the danger lurking at their door, and how the same man, had stood over them with a knife raised high, ready to strike. She told them how she had screamed in the dream but no sound came, how she had tried to move but had been held motionless, and how she had awakened drenched in cold sweat, convinced the dream was more than imagination. Jane's face paled slightly as she listened. But that was only a dream, Elizabeth. A terrible dream, yes, but nothing more. Elizabeth closed her eyes. I thought so too, until today. Her husband leaned forward. But dreams do not spill into waking life. They cannot harm us. Elizabeth opened her eyes, and the despair in them was so raw it made Jane step back. This one can. This is no ordinary nightmare. He was in my room. He has been in every place we have gone. He is not following me as a man follows another. He is following, like destiny. Jane sat beside her, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. My dear, you are exhausted. You have traveled too far, seen too many new places, endured too many restless nights. Everything feels larger and darker when we are tired. But Elizabeth shook her head, her voice trembling. That is not it. He wants something from me. Her husband frowned. What could he possibly want from you? I don't know, she whispered, but I feel him calling me. The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside, a cart rolled past on the road, the wheels crunching softly across gravel. A bird chirped from a nearby hedge, but inside, the quiet pulsed with unspoken dread. Jane's fingers tightened slightly where they rested on Elizabeth's shoulder. Robin arrived soon after, his boots dusty from the fields. He entered the room with a cheerful greeting that faltered the moment he saw the expressions waiting for him. What has happened? You all look as if a funeral has passed through here. Elizabeth's husband sighed, rubbing his forehead. She says the harvest man, the one sitting at the hedge, was the man from her dream. Robin blinked. Impossible. But even as he said it, a subtle unease flickered in his eyes. Elizabeth watched him, seeing the shift, seeing the point at which disbelief meets uncertainty. She took a long, shuddering breath. Robin, you must be careful. You and Jane both. Please, do not go near that man. Robin laughed lightly, though the sound was strained. Elizabeth, my dear, he is a laborer, nothing more. He is here for the harvest, not for murder. Elizabeth's voice dropped to a whisper. I saw him, with a knife, standing over you, in the dream. Robin's smile faded. He cleared his throat, glancing at his wife, then at Elizabeth. Dreams are strange things. They stitch together frightful images when the mind is weary. But his tone betrayed him. He was no longer quite so sure. That night, Elizabeth's husband decided she must rest before they discussed anything further. She was escorted upstairs, Morris fussing over her with motherly concern. Once she was safely in bed, he returned downstairs to Robin and Jane, who were speaking in hushed voices near the hearth. She believes this man is dangerous, her husband said quietly. Robin shook his head. He is an Irish harvester rough, yes, but harmless. He has worked here for several seasons. But she saw him, Jane murmured. She truly believes. She did not finish. Robin exhaled heavily. Dreams do strange things, but uncertainty hung between them like a veil. Upstairs, Elizabeth lay awake in the dim flicker of the bedside candle. The night pressed close around her, thick and watchful. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps. Every whisper of wind against the window felt like breath. She closed her eyes, praying she would not dream again. Yet even in the darkness, she felt it, the faint sensation of someone calling her name, not with sound, but with a pull that tugged at the edges of her mind, soft, insistent, drawing her closer. She clutched the blankets to her chest, her breath trembling. Somewhere in the night, whether in the fields or in her memory, she felt the man's presence stir, and she knew this was only the beginning. Night settled over the Watsons' farmhouse with a hush so complete it felt almost deliberate, as though the darkness itself were holding its breath. Inside the guest room, Elizabeth lay very still beneath the thin linen sheets, her eyes wide open. Sleep had become an enemy she feared more than exhaustion itself. She fought it with every shallow breath, terrified that surrendering to rest would pull her back into the realm where he waited, silent, patient, inevitable. The house was quiet in that heavy rural way. The ticking of a distant clock, the faint settling of wooden beams, an occasional soft murmur from the animals outside, all perfectly ordinary sounds, yet each one seemed magnified within Elizabeth's heightened senses, as though the night were stretching them into something unnatural. She pressed her palms against the blanket, willing herself to stay awake, but exhaustion draped itself around her like a fog. Her eyelids drooped, her breath steadied, her grip loosened. In moments, she slid helplessly into sleep, and the dream took her immediately. There was no transition, no gentle slipping into imagery. One moment she lay in bed, the next she stood in the Watsons' darkened hallway. The house was silent, lit only by a dim glimmer of moonlight seeping through a small window. Her bare feet felt the chill of the wooden floorboards. She tried to call out, "Jane? Robin?" her husband, but her voice did not obey. Even her thoughts felt distant, muffled, as though submerged under thick water. She walked forward, not by her own will but by a slow, steady pull she could not resist. Her fingers brushed the wall for support, but her legs moved without her command. Down the hallway she glided, as though an invisible hand guided her. The hush of night deepened, pressing against her ears, her chest, her very heartbeat. She reached the landing above the staircase, and there, standing directly below, in the open space between the moonlit window and the worn banister, was the man with the terrible nose. He stood in perfect stillness, his shadow stretching unnaturally long behind him. His posture was rigid, almost statue-like, yet his eyes glowed with a sly, knowing gleam. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs, but her feet refused to move. She could not run, she could not scream. She was trapped in the dream, caught in a loop between consciousness and nightmare. His lips did not move, yet she heard him. "Come." The word was not spoken aloud, not shaped by breath or voice. It struck her mind like an echo from inside her own skull. She shook her head. It was the only movement she could control, but it made no difference. He lifted his hand slowly, deliberately. In that hand glinted a knife, a long, thin blade, its edge catching the faint glow of the moon. Elizabeth's terror surged. She tried to wrench herself from the unseen hold, but her limbs betrayed her. Her feet descended the stairs one step at a time, drawn toward him against her will. Her fingers clawed at the air, at her nightdress, at the railing. Anything but nothing slowed her descent. She was halfway down when she heard another sound. Breathing. Soft, steady, unaware. Jane's breathing. It came from the parlor where Jane and Robin slept that night, too nervous to leave Elizabeth alone in the upstairs rooms. The door was ajar, a sliver of faint lamplight spilling into the hall. Elizabeth understood everything with a sudden, sickening clarity. This was not about her, not at this moment. This dream, the same dream she'd had before, was not simply a projection of terror. It was a warning she had been too afraid to believe. She tried to force her voice to break through the dream's paralysis. Her throat strained, her lips parted. A faint rasp emerged. "Jane, Robin, wake up." But the words were barely breath. The man's gaze slid toward the parlor door, and a terrible smile crept slowly across his face. A smile so deliberate it felt like the cutting edge of the blade in his hand. He took one step toward the parlor, then another. Elizabeth felt her heart collapse inward. She had to stop him. She hurled herself forward. At least, she thought she did. But in the dream, her body remained motionless, frozen like a figure carved from wax. "No!" she tried to scream. In the waking world, The sound burst from her throat, sharp and startling. Her husband woke with a jolt. He leapt from the bed, heart pounding, as Elizabeth's cry echoed through the quiet farmhouse. He found her sitting upright, drenched in sweat, trembling so violently the bedding shook with her. Her eyes were wide, staring into corners where only harmless shadows lived. He grasped her arms. "Elizabeth, wake up! It's only a dream!" She shook her head fiercely. No, not a dream. He was going into their room. He had a knife. Her husband, felt a stab of cold fear. "Elizabeth, listen to me. You are safe. Jane and Robin are safe." "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, they are not." He was standing at the foot of the stairs. He watched me. He smiled. Her husband turned toward the door, suddenly uneasy. The hallway outside was dark, silent, entirely still. But the image she described clung to his mind with an unsettling persistence. Before he could reach the handle, the door opened gently from the other side. Jane stepped in, carrying a small candle, her face drawn with concern. I heard her cry out, "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth stared at her with disbelief, as though seeing her alive was proof that nightmares could still be undone, at least for now. Tears blurred her vision. She reached for Jane's hand, as if needing to confirm she was real. Jane sat beside her on the bed. "My dear, it was only a nightmare." Elizabeth looked into her friend's calm, earnest eyes, and felt a rush of terror so overpowering she could barely breathe. "No," she whispered. "It was a warning." Jane and Elizabeth's husband exchanged glances, soft with pity, heavy with uncertainty. Robin soon appeared behind Jane, rumpled from sleep but alert, concern etched across his brow. Elizabeth stared at him as though expecting to see a wound, a shadow, a sign of danger. Nothing. He stood unharmed, alive, human, perfectly ordinary. For now, her husband placed a soothing hand on her back. "Elizabeth, you must rest. You've strained yourself to the very edge." But Elizabeth shook her head. "Something is coming. I feel it. I don't know when or how, but it is coming." She saw the doubt in their faces, and something inside her broke, a small, quiet fracture that made her realize she was now utterly alone in her certainty. She clung to the bed frame, shivering, her breaths sharp and uneven. Her friend tried to reassure her. Her husband tried to hold her steady. Robin fetched water, but none of it reached her. Because the dream had not felt like a dream. It had felt like an event she had witnessed, a future she could not stop, a fate that was already in motion. And as she curled beneath the trembling light of the candle, Elizabeth understood the terrible truth. The man with the dreadful nose was no longer just haunting her. He was haunting everything and everyone she loved. For the next 2 days, Elizabeth lived in a strange half-existence caught between a waking world that insisted on rationality and an inner world where danger prowled just beyond the reach of sight. Jane and Robin treated her with unwavering kindness, yet she sensed the shift in their eyes, a soft, troubled compassion, the quiet suspicion that perhaps she had become overwrought by fear. Her husband remained steadfastly by her side, but even he could not hide the fatigue that sagged in his posture, nor the unspoken dread that shadowed his gaze each time her breath hitched or her hands trembled. The Watsons' farmhouse, once a sanctuary of domestic peace, now felt like a stage awaiting an unseen catastrophe. Every room seemed infused with a palpable anticipation, as if the house itself held its breath along with its trembling guest. At night, the wind pressed against the shutters with restless fingers, and the soft cries of owls drifted across the fields, like warnings no one fully understood. Elizabeth tried desperately to remain calm. She sat near the large window overlooking Robin's land, attempting embroidery. Though her hands shook so violently she pricked her fingers repeatedly. She tried reading, but the words refused to stay on the page. She walked the grounds with Jane, yet even in the bright sunshine, her gaze scanned every hedge and shadow for a figure that did not appear. But even without his physical presence, she felt him. The sense of being watched, of being followed not by footsteps, but by intention, clung to her like a second skin. She would turn suddenly, expecting to find someone behind her, yet the path stretched empty. She would slip into uneasy sleep only to jolt awake, heart pounding, convinced she had heard her name whispered against her ear. The dream had changed her. It had drawn a boundary she knew she could not cross back over. She had glimpsed something that was not merely fear, but a plan unfolding around her. And there was something else, something she had not told anyone, not even her husband. Each time she closed her eyes, even for a second, she saw the man's smile. Not a smile of delight or recognition, but a smile of possession, as if he already knew the ending of the story, and she was only just beginning to understand it. On the third day, Jane convinced her to take fresh air in the orchard behind the house. The trees were heavy with ripening apples, their branches swaying comfortingly in the breeze. The orchard had always been Jane's refuge, her favorite place, and she hoped its familiar charm might soothe Elizabeth's frayed nerves. They walked slowly between the rows of trees, Jane speaking softly of trivial things, the preserves she planned to make, the hens that had at last begun laying consistently, the letters she'd received from an old school friend. Elizabeth tried to listen, tried to sink into Jane's steady presence, but her thoughts pulsed with dread, quickening with each step. Jane turned to her suddenly. "Elizabeth, do you trust me?" Elizabeth blinked, startled. "Of course I do." "Then let me tell you something." Jane paused, choosing her words as one chooses delicate glass. "I think you are braver than anyone gives you credit for. But I also think you have carried far too much alone. Sometimes fear becomes stronger when we try to hide from it." Elizabeth opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth lodged painfully in her chest. She had hidden things, little pieces of fear she dared not speak for fear of appearing mad. She hesitated, then whispered, "There is something I haven't told anyone." Jane squeezed her hand gently. "What is it?" Elizabeth swallowed hard. "Since that night, the night I dreamed of you and Robin, I feel as though I am being pulled toward something, as if someone walks beside me, even when I am alone. And when I sleep," her voice faltered, "I feel as though he enters my dreams not because I fear him, but because he wants me there." Jane stopped walking. Concern deepened the lines around her eyes. "Elizabeth, you must speak to your husband, tell him everything, exactly as you told me." "I don't want him to think I've lost my reason," Elizabeth whispered. "I can bear fear, Jane. I cannot bear his doubt." Jane embraced her. "He loves you. He will never doubt you." Elizabeth wanted to believe that, but doubt once born was difficult to banish. As they walked back toward the house, Jane's steady presence grounded her somewhat. The shadows seemed less menacing. The breeze felt less like a whisper and more like a simple movement of nature. Elizabeth even found herself breathing more freely, but her fragile calm shattered the moment they approached the kitchen door. Morris, the maid, burst out, her face chalk-white, her apron stained with something she had dropped in her panic. "Oh, Mrs. Watson, sir, ma'am, someone's been looking in at the windows." Jane stiffened. "What do you mean, looking in?" Morris pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "A man, ma'am, tall, dark coat, stood right outside the sitting-room window, staring in. I only saw him a second before he vanished, scared the breath right out of me." Elizabeth felt the world tilt. Jane caught her arm quickly. "It's a misunderstanding, some traveler looking for directions." But Morris shook her head violently. "No traveler lurks like that, ma'am. He stood there, as still as a gravestone. And his face, oh, his face, what about his face?" Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. "It were the nose, ma'am," Morris replied, voice quivering, long and cruel, like something carved wrong. Elizabeth's knees buckled. Jane and the maid caught her before she fell. Her husband appeared at the sound of the commotion. When he saw Elizabeth's ashen face, he rushed to her side, guiding her into the sitting room. She clung to him, trembling violently, as he whispered soothing words she no longer believed. Robin arrived moments later, breathless from the fields. "What's happened?" Jane exchanged a grave look with him. "He was here, Robin. That man." Morris saw him. Robin's jaw tightened. "Where?" "Outside the window," Morris whispered. Robin stepped toward the glass, peering out with searching eyes. The orchard swayed innocently. The path lay empty, but something cold settled into his expression. "Well," he said slowly, "he's gone now." But Elizabeth shook her head. "No," she whispered. "He is never gone." And for the first time, not only her husband, but Jane and Robin too, felt the truth in her words. Not because they believed the supernatural, not because they feared a ghost, but because they too now sensed that something was watching them, something human, something relentless, something that had already chosen its moment. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She did not know when the storm would break, only that it would, and that the man with the terrible nose had not come merely to haunt her dreams. He had come to finish something, something that had begun long before she understood it. For the remainder of the afternoon, the Watsons' farmhouse seemed wrapped in a strange, uneasy quiet, a stillness so charged it felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The orchard swayed in muted rhythm, the fields shimmered beneath the light of late summer, and yet there was an invisible tension thrumming beneath everything, a feeling that no one could name but all could sense. Even Robin, usually so grounded, so dismissive of superstition, moved about the house with a subtle alertness, his gaze drifting toward each window as though expecting something to reappear. Inside, Elizabeth sat trembling by the fireplace, her knees drawn close, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Though Morris brought her tea and blankets and murmured soft, reassuring words, nothing could warm the cold that clung stubbornly to her bones. She felt as if she had crossed the threshold of some unseen boundary, one from which there was no turning back. The world no longer responded to her in the way it once had. It felt distorted, stretched thin by an unseen force that pressed closer with each passing moment. Her husband remained near her, keeping watch with a vigilance born not of fear alone, but of growing conviction. Something was happening, something that defied his sense of order. He had not yet embraced Elizabeth's belief in the supernatural, but he could no longer entirely deny that danger stalked them in a form no ordinary reasoning could explain. Late in the afternoon, Jane sat beside Elizabeth, taking her cold hands gently between her own. "You must try to rest," she urged softly. "Your nerves are worn to threads." Elizabeth shook her head faintly. "I cannot sleep, because when I sleep, he finds me. And now, he comes when I wake, too." Jane's expression softened with pity, though fear glimmered beneath her calm. "No one can harm you here. Robin is near. Your husband is here. You are safe." Elizabeth lifted her gaze, her eyes hollow with dread. "No one is safe when he is close, and he is close now. I feel it." Jane tried to respond, but a rustle at the window silenced both women. Morris, who was tidying the hearth, froze. Elizabeth's breath stopped completely. Robin's voice called from the entryway, steady but laced with tension. "It's only the wind. The evening breeze is picking up." But none of them truly believed that. Evening descended slowly, the sky filling with streaks of gold and violet. Lamps were lit throughout the house, casting gentle halos that banished the encroaching gloom. The light should have brought comfort, warmth, normality. Instead, it only accentuated the corners of the rooms, the corners where shadows seemed too deep, too thick, too expectant. Dinner was a tense affair. Jane tried to maintain her usual bright cheer, offering generous helpings, speaking about the harvest, the upcoming fair, anything that might spark conversation. But Elizabeth picked at her food, unable to swallow more than a few bites. Her husband pretended to eat, though every few moments his eyes flickered to the window. Morris moved quickly and quietly, casting furtive glances outside whenever she thought no one was watching. Robin ate in silence, his jaw tight. Once dinner ended, Jane suggested music. She moved to the pianoforte, her fingers trembling only slightly, as she began a soft, pastoral tune meant to soothe the nerves. The melody floated gently through the house, the kind of tune that normally lifted spirits, and for a moment the tension eased, replaced by something almost peaceful. But the peace did not last. Elizabeth stiffened suddenly. She turned her head sharply toward the darkened window beside the pianoforte. Her husband saw her go rigid, saw the terror widening her eyes, and followed her gaze instinctively. There was nothing, only the night beyond the glass, the orchard blurred into shadows, the faint glimmer of moonlight touching the edge of the window pane. But Elizabeth continued to stare, breath held, as though she saw something the others could not. Then she whispered, "He is watching." Jane's fingers faltered on the keys. The room fell silent, except for the faint crackle of the lamp. Robin stood. "I'll check outside." "No," Elizabeth cried, her voice cracking. "Don't go out there, please, Robin. He will be waiting for you." Robin hesitated. His skepticism warred with something new, fear, perhaps, or at least respect for the fear that filled the room like a living presence. He looked at Jane, then at Elizabeth's husband, and finally nodded. "I won't go far," he promised. "But I must look. If someone is lurking around my home, I'll see him." Despite Elizabeth's pleas, Robin took up a lantern and stepped outside. The others crowded near the window, watching anxiously as he moved through the garden, the lantern's glow swaying with each step. His silhouette moved toward the hedge, paused, then continued. Elizabeth clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug crescent moons into her palms. Her husband held her shoulders, murmuring comfort she could not hear. Jane hovered beside them, unable to tear her eyes from the scene outside. Robin made a slow circle of the yard, lifting the lantern to peer behind trees, along the fence, across the path. The light traced wide arcs over the earth, illuminating nothing but grass, leaves, and the hushed shapes of sleeping flowers. After several tense minutes, he returned. "No one," he said, stepping inside. "No one at all." Elizabeth sagged against her husband, her breath escaping in a shaky gasp, but she did not look relieved. Instead, she whispered, "He's hiding. He doesn't want to be seen, only felt." Robin set the lantern on the table. "Elizabeth, this cannot continue. You are letting this fear devour you. The man you saw, if you saw anyone at all, is gone. There is nothing out there." Elizabeth met his eyes, and for the first time, Robin faltered. There was something in her gaze, something raw, desperate, and fiercely lucid. She was not raving. She was not confused. She was terrified with the clarity of someone who knows a truth too awful to speak aloud. "He is out there," she said quietly, "because he wants something from me, and he will not leave until he has it." Her husband took her hand gently. "We will not let anything happen to you," she squeezed back, tears gathering in her lashes. "You don't understand. It isn't only about me. He wants—" She stopped abruptly, her lips trembling. Jane knelt beside her. "He wants what, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth shook her head, unable to finish, because in her heart she knew the answer, and she prayed she was wrong. Night deepened around the farmhouse. The lamps burned with a nervous flicker. Every creak of wood, every sigh of wind, every distant sound seemed to press closer, as though the darkness were inching inward with the patience of a predator. Elizabeth curled against her husband, her body trembling. Morris retired reluctantly to her room, leaving the Watsons to keep vigil. Robin fetched another lantern. Jane moved the chairs closer together, as though proximity alone could keep danger at bay. And in the dim hush of that tense night, Elizabeth felt it again, a whisper of presence, a pressure that was not wind, a pull she could not escape. The unseen thread tightened, and she knew the man with the dreadful nose was near, not in dream, not in shadow, but in the waking world, closer than ever before. Night had deepened into that dense, breathless hour when even the bravest spirits grow uneasy. The house lay still under the heavy velvet of darkness, and though every lamp burned low in the drawing room, their warm glow seemed only to push shadows into tighter, more watchful corners. Jane sat close to Elizabeth, their chairs drawn together near the fireplace, while Robin paced slowly, lantern in hand, every now and then pausing to peer out a window, as if expecting the darkness to speak. Elizabeth's husband stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of protection he no longer pretended was unnecessary. Elizabeth remained seated, her posture tense, her hands linked tightly in her lap. She stared into the fire, the flickering light dancing across her pale face, illuminating the trembling curve of her lower lip. She felt the weight of the room's unease pressing down on her chest, yet she knew something else pressed from beyond the house, something far more patient, far more deliberate. It was not the wind that stirred her nerves, not the house, not even her own imagination. It was him. Hours passed in tense silence. Occasionally, Jane attempted to draw Elizabeth into conversation, asking gentle questions about their previous travels, trying to guide her mind to safer ground. Elizabeth responded at first, her voice soft and distant, but soon, even those faint attempts at conversation dissolved into silence. She felt the pull again, that invisible thread tightening somewhere just out of sight, tugging faintly at the edges of her mind. Her husband noticed the subtle change in her breathing. "Elizabeth," he murmured, bending slightly toward her, "if you are tired, let me take you upstairs. You cannot sit awake all night." She shook her head quickly, fear flaring in her eyes. "No, upstairs he will find me. He always finds me in the dark, when I am alone." "You will not be alone," he said gently. "I will stay with you." "You cannot stop him," she whispered. "Not in dreams, not in that place where he speaks to me." Her husband opened his mouth to argue, but Robin interrupted with a voice tight with something like frustration. "Elizabeth, dreams cannot harm you. Whatever this man is, whoever he is flesh and blood. If he comes in the waking world, I will deal with him. But he cannot enter your mind." Elizabeth looked up at him with a hollow expression that extinguished the certainty in his words. "He already has." The clock struck midnight. The chime echoed through the house like a soft warning. Morris, awakened by the sound of quiet voices and the eerie atmosphere, crept down the stairs barefoot, carrying a candle more for courage than illumination. When she appeared at the doorway, her face was strained with worry. "Sir," she whispered to Elizabeth's husband, "begging pardon, but I swore I heard someone outside again. Just now, slow footsteps, out by the orchard." Elizabeth stiffened violently. Her husband placed a firm hand on her shoulder, as if trying to anchor her to the earth. Robin set his jaw and reached for the lantern with renewed resolve. "I'll check again." "No," Elizabeth gasped, half rising from her chair. "Robin, he wants you to come outside. That is how it happened in the dream. He lured you out. Don't go." Robin hesitated at that, gripping the lantern more tightly. His skeptical calm cracked just enough for uncertainty to slip through. Jane moved toward him, touched his arm, and whispered something only he heard. He searched her face, then slowly lowered the lantern. "All right," he conceded. "I'll not go far. I'll only stand at the threshold. If anyone is out there, I'll see him without stepping into the dark." Despite Elizabeth's protest, Robin moved to the front door and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. The lantern's glow spilled across the porch and a small patch of gravel. Beyond that, the darkness was impenetrable, a void that swallowed light whole. Robin stood there a long moment, scarcely breathing, listening. No footsteps, no voice, no movement, only the vast, suffocating quiet of the rural night. After a long silence, he shut the door and returned. "Nothing," he said firmly, though his eyes betrayed lingering doubt. Whatever Morris heard, it was not a man. Elizabeth stared at him with such raw conviction that Robin looked away first. The house fell silent again. Jane resumed her place at Elizabeth's side, and Morris curled quietly near the hearth, unwilling to sleep but trying not to intrude. Elizabeth's husband sat close, gently rubbing his thumb over the back of her hand, hoping the small gesture might bring comfort. But comfort was no longer possible. Near 1 o'clock, Elizabeth's head drooped slightly. Exhaustion tugged at her with irresistible force. She fought it, lifting her chin sharply, but her eyelids fluttered heavily. Jane touched her shoulder gently. "Let yourself rest, dear friend. We are all here. Nothing can happen while we watch." Elizabeth wanted to believe that. She wanted to sink into rest without feeling the cold breath of the nightmare waiting for her on the other side. But she had learned to fear sleep more than wakefulness. She inhaled sharply, willing herself to remain upright. Her husband leaned close. "Sleep for a little while," he whispered. "I will wake you if anything seems amiss. I swear it." She turned her head toward him, her gaze heavy and sorrowful. "You do not understand. He comes for me in sleep because he cannot reach me in waking. But every time I dream, I go closer to him." He squeezed her hand tightly. "Then I will not let you dream." But that promise was one no human could keep. Her strength crumbled. Her head fell against his shoulder. Her breathing slowed. Her fingers loosened like petals drifting from a flower. Her husband felt the moment she slipped into unconsciousness, the instant when her muscles slackened and her body surrendered to the exhaustion she had fought for days. And almost immediately, Elizabeth's face twisted in distress. Her brow furrowed. Her lips parted. A faint tremor passed over her shoulders. Jane leaned forward in alarm. "Is she dreaming already?" "She just fell asleep," her husband whispered. "She cannot." But then Elizabeth's mouth opened, and a single word escaped, soft, trembling, heartbreaking. "No." Her husband felt his throat tighten. "Elizabeth!" Her fingers twitched. Her breathing grew shallow. Jane reached out, taking Elizabeth's cold hand. Robin stepped closer, lantern lowered, watching with grim anxiety. Elizabeth's lips moved again, forming a silent plea. Then a whisper emerged, barely audible. "Don't make me come." Her husband shook her gently. "Elizabeth, wake up now." But Elizabeth did not wake. Her head rolled slightly to one side, her hair falling like a curtain of shadow over her face. Her voice, fragile as breath, broke the silence again. "He's here." At that moment, the lantern flame flickered violently, as though disturbed by a gust of wind that no one felt. Morris made a small cry and clutched her apron. Jane gasped, her grip tightening on Elizabeth's hand. Robin stared at the door, jaw clenched. Elizabeth's husband leaned over her, desperate. "Elizabeth, open your eyes." But she was trapped somewhere else, somewhere between the living world and the one that called her. Her next whisper chilled every soul in the room. "He wants me now." And the house, quiet, ancient, and filled with its fearful witnesses, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something they could neither see nor stop. The moment Elizabeth whispered those words, "He wants me now," a shiver ran through the room so deep and sudden that even the lamps seemed to recoil. Her husband felt his heart thundering violently against his ribs as he grasped her shoulders, desperate to pull her out of the terrible realm into which she had slipped. But Elizabeth remained motionless, except for the trembling of her lips. Her eyelids clenched shut as if pinned by an invisible force. The light in the sitting room flickered again, not with the softness of a guttering flame, but with the sharp, irregular pulse of something disturbed. Robin stepped forward, lantern raised high, his jaw set with an unspoken resolve. Jane knelt beside her friend, tears forming in her eyes as she shook Elizabeth's hand and whispered her name over and over. Morris hovered in the doorway, a small, frightened figure who clutched the edge of the tablecloth as though it were the only thing tethering her to sanity. Elizabeth's husband bent low over her. "Elizabeth," he urged, his voice trembling despite himself. "Listen to me. You are dreaming. You are safe. Wake up." But she did not wake. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, as though each inhale cost her a terrible effort. Her fingers curled tightly, clutching at the air as if gripping someone's hand in the dark. Then her head tilted back with a slow, unnatural movement, and a faint gasp rose from her throat. "He is here." she whispered again, though her lips barely moved. He is calling. Jane pressed a hand to her own mouth to stifle a sob. Her pulse is racing, she said in a trembling voice. We must wake her. They shook her gently at first, then more urgently, but her body resisted every attempt. She seemed suspended between two worlds, held fast by a presence none of them could see but all could feel pressing in around them. Suddenly, Elizabeth's rigid form relaxed, not fully, but enough that they all froze in dread. Her eyes remained shut, but her expression shifted, the fear draining into a terrible, hollow stillness. When she spoke, her voice was low, distant, and utterly unlike her own. He waits outside. The words cut through the room like a blade. Robin's lantern quivered in his grip. He turned slowly toward the window, his breath catching. The curtains stirred in the faint breeze from the cracked pane. The orchard beyond was black and impenetrable. Though they saw nothing, the force of Elizabeth's conviction seeped into the air like cold smoke. Her husband tried again, gripping her hands tightly. Elizabeth, wake up. You must wake up. Do not listen to him. But she only whispered back, He won't leave me. Not now. A beat of silence followed, heavy, suffocating, before Elizabeth gave a sudden, twisted cry, as though someone had seized her from behind. Her body buckled forward, then jerked back violently. Jane cried out in alarm, clinging to her friend's arm. Morris dropped to her knees, sobbing into her apron. Robin strode forward and snatched Elizabeth's shoulders, trying to steady her trembling form. What is happening to her? He demanded, though no one could answer. Then, without warning, Elizabeth's eyes opened. They were blank-wide, glassy, unseeing. A wave of horror washed over her husband. He cupped her face in both hands. Elizabeth, look at me. It's your husband. Look at me. Slowly, her gaze drifted toward him. But the emptiness behind her eyes made his blood run cold. He has found the door, she said softly, as though reciting something whispered into her ear. He is coming in. Robin lunged toward the front door, driven by instinct. I'll bolt it, he shouted. No, Elizabeth cried, with sudden violent force. He isn't coming through the door. He doesn't need it. He is already here. A strange, sharp sound split the air, something like a muffled thud, as if a heavy object had struck the wall outside. The lamps flickered violently. The shadows seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Every head turned, and Elizabeth screamed. Her scream was unlike anything they had heard before, raw, primal, tearing from deep within her as though something inside her had snapped. She clutched at the sides of her head, nails digging into her scalp. Get him out, she shrieked. Get him out of my mind. He is pulling. Please, please stop him. Jane and Morris rushed to hold her, but Elizabeth thrashed with desperate strength. Her husband tried to restrain her arms, tears streaking his face, begging her to return to him. She shook him off with a force that seemed unnatural for her frail frame. Then, as abruptly as it began, the struggle ceased. Elizabeth collapsed forward, falling into her husband's arms like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Her breathing slowed to a faint flutter. Her eyes slid half shut, unfocused. She murmured something unintelligible, her voice soft and broken. Jane leaned close. What did she say? He listened intently, bending until his ear touched his wife's trembling lips. And then he heard it. He wants to show me where she is. His blood turned to ice. She? Jane echoed, her voice quavering. Who does she mean? What is she saying? Elizabeth barely managed to whisper. He says, she's waiting. Just beyond. Her words trailed off in a sigh so fragile it frightened them all. Robin crossed himself unconsciously. This is madness, he whispered. She is delirious. No, Jane whispered. She believes it. Elizabeth's husband shook her gently. Elizabeth, who is she? Who is waiting? Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered, and for a brief, terrible moment, clarity lit her expression clearer than it had been in days. She, Elizabeth whispered, is the one he took before me. Then she fell silent, completely still. Her breath was shallow, but steady, her body limp, but not lifeless. She had slipped not into unconsciousness, but into a deeper, darker place neither dream nor waking could reach. Jane burst into quiet tears. Morris clung to her apron like a child. Robin lowered the lantern, his face pale. Her husband held her close, his arms trembling. He pressed his forehead against her hair, whispering her name, begging her to come back to him. But Elizabeth did not hear him. She was far away, walking a path she had not chosen, guided by a hand she could not refuse. And in the suffocating quiet that settled over the house, everyone felt it. The man with the dreadful nose had grown stronger, closer, hungrier, and Elizabeth was slipping into his world, one breath at a time. The hours after Elizabeth collapsed into that eerie, half-conscious state were some of the longest the Watsons' household had ever endured. The night had fallen into its deepest, most unnerving silence. Even the animals outside seemed to have taken refuge from something unseen. No hoot of an owl, no distant bark of a dog, no whisper of wind through the orchard broke the stillness. It was as though the entire world had paused, listening. Elizabeth lay on the sofa now, her head resting in her husband's lap. Her breathing remained shallow, fragile, sometimes pausing just long enough for her husband's heart to seize before it resumed again. Jane sat beside her, clutching one of her hands, whispering soft encouragements that felt too small for the weight of the moment. Morris hovered near the doorway, her face blotched with fear, unable to decide whether to stay or flee. And Robin stood guard by the window, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond, lantern held like a weapon. Her husband stroked her temple with trembling fingers, murmuring her name over and over. He could not feel her respond, not in body, not in spirit. She remained suspended in that awful limbo, her consciousness consumed by something far outside their reach. From time to time her lips moved, but no coherent words formed, only broken fragments, soft, wandering murmurs, like someone walking through fog calling out for someone who wasn't there. Once, she whispered with surprising clarity, "I'm afraid, so afraid." Her husband nearly broke. He pressed her hand to his lips, desperate to pull her back with touch alone, but nothing changed. The clock struck 1, then 2. Time passed, but the atmosphere did not shift. It remained as oppressive as the moment she first cried out. They tended to her as best they could. Morris fetched warm cloths, Jane changed her pillow, Robin checked the locks again and again, but they did not speak much anymore. Words felt too fragile, too easily shattered by the quiet. Then, some time past 3, the lamp nearest the window flickered, not the unsteady stutter of a dying flame, but a sharp, sudden sputter, as if something unseen had brushed past it. Jane froze. Robin lifted the lantern. Morris let out a muffled gasp. Her husband's breath caught. Elizabeth stirred. A tiny movement, barely perceptible, but enough. Her fingers twitched. Her lips parted. Her eyelids trembled, though they did not open. He leaned closer. "Elizabeth, my love, can you hear me?" A faint sound escaped her throat, half whisper, half sigh. He lowered his ear to her lips. "He's outside." Her husband stiffened. "No one is outside. You are safe. You are safe with me." But Elizabeth shook her head weakly. "You don't understand. He's walking around the house." Robin stepped toward the window, jaw clenched. "This is nonsense. Elizabeth is dreaming." Jane rose. But she isn't asleep, and that truth sat like a stone in all their stomachs. Elizabeth wasn't dreaming. She had not returned to sleep. She was awake inside some terrifying space between consciousness and something else, something watching. Elizabeth's voice came again, thin and trembling. "He's searching, looking for the door that opens from both sides." Her husband's heart lurched painfully. "What door? Elizabeth, look at me. You're here. You're not going anywhere." But she wasn't listening to him. Her head tilted, as though following distant footsteps only she could hear. Her lips quivered. He found it. Her husband's blood ran cold. Jane grasped Elizabeth's other hand. "Who found what, dear heart?" Tell us." Elizabeth sucked in a sharp, trembling breath. "He found me." A near-audible crack seemed to pierce the air like the moment before a storm splits the sky. Robin stepped back from the window. Morris sank to her knees. Jane clasped Elizabeth's hand tighter, as if afraid it would slip away. Her husband's voice broke. "Elizabeth, listen to me. He cannot take you. He cannot reach you. I won't let him." But Elizabeth shook her head slowly, her eyes fluttering behind closed lids as though she were watching a scene unfold before her. "It's too late." A sudden pounding noise struck the very walls, dull, distant, but unmistakable. Jane gasped. Morris screamed softly. Robin rushed toward the front hall, lantern swinging violently in his hand. Her husband bolted upright, lifting Elizabeth in his arms. "What was that?" Jane cried. No answer. The house had gone silent again. Elizabeth's breathing slowed to an eerie calm, as though she had drifted somewhere too far for panic to reach. Her eyelids ceased trembling. Her body relaxed in his arms with a limpness that frightened him more than her earlier thrashing. "Elizabeth," he whispered frantically. "Wake up. Look at me. Stay with me." But she did not stir. It was Jane who noticed it first. A faint glow in the hallway, so soft it might have been mistaken for reflected lamplight. But Robin was still in the hall, still moving, still holding the lantern in his hand. This glow came from somewhere else, from the crack beneath the back door. Her husband stood frozen in horror as an icy, prickling sensation crawled across his spine. Morris clutched the sofa upholstery until her knuckles went bone-white. Jane stepped back instinctively, instinct screaming that something unnatural pressed against the threshold. Robin's voice rang out suddenly from the hall. "There's no one here, no one outside either door." But his voice sounded too loud, too urgent, as if he were trying not to believe his own words. Elizabeth's voice broke through the tense hush once more. "He's inside." Jane let out a soft sob. Her husband shook Elizabeth gently. "Inside where?" "Elizabeth, wake up." But Elizabeth's chest rose and fell slowly, peacefully, too peacefully. Her expression took on a strange serenity, as though she had accepted something none of them could see. "He's here," she murmured faintly. "He's waiting, just behind the light." Robin stepped into the sitting room again, lantern held high. "No one is here," he snapped, more forcefully this time, as if shouting down the rising terror. "You are all letting fear turn shadows into ghosts." But even as he said the words, he found his gaze drifting toward the corner behind the piano, dark, silent, untouched by lamplight. The darkness pooled there like liquid velvet, deep, patient, unmoving. Elizabeth stirred once more, only a slight movement, but enough to draw everyone's eyes back to her. "He has come," she whispered. Her husband felt her pulse, found it rapid and faint beneath his fingertips. Jane fell to her knees beside them. "Elizabeth, please tell us what he wants." Elizabeth's lips parted slowly, and this time she spoke with clarity that cut straight through the room. "He wants me to go where she went." A stunned silence followed. "Who?" her husband whispered, voice barely forming the word. Elizabeth's eyes opened, just a sliver, just enough for them to see that she was looking at something far away, something beyond them all. "The woman he took before me." Her head fell back, her eyes closed, her breathing steadied. But the room had changed. The air was charged with a presence none of them could deny anymore. Robin swallowed hard. Jane trembled violently. Morris buried her face in her apron, and Elizabeth's husband held her close, realizing the truth. They were no longer dealing with fear. They were dealing with fate. Fate, and the man who had walked out of her nightmares into their waking world. As we step back from the haunting world of tales for Christmas Eve, one truth becomes clear. Rhoda Broughton did not simply write ghost stories. She explored the fragile spaces where fear, memory, and desire blur into something far more mysterious. Her characters move through landscapes shaped as much by their inner turmoil as by the shadows around them. Dreams spill into waking life. The past folds into the present, and the supernatural becomes less a phantom threat than a mirror held up to the vulnerabilities of the human heart. Elizabeth's journey reminds us how terror often begins not with monsters, but with the quiet erosion of certainty, when what we believe to be imagination starts echoing reality too closely. Each step in the story tightens the fabric of dread, inviting us to question what we see, what we fear, and what we choose to ignore. These Victorian tales endure not because of their ghosts, but because of their insight into the emotional and psychological depths of those who encounter them. If you've enjoyed unraveling this chilling narrative, its atmosphere, its hidden meanings, and its delicate blend of beauty and dread, I invite you to stay with us a little longer. Subscribe to Havelin Storytime to continue exploring the world of classic mysteries, Gothic tales, forgotten legends, and stories that linger long after the last page is turned. There are many more shadows to walk through, many more secrets to uncover, and we'll uncover them together.